One of the many kind of happy conflicts in some ways we can often explore is often what's best anatomically can often be sometimes at conflict with, for example, how we move in performance, and vice versa. What can be good, say, for performance and skill acquisition and awareness can often then, sometimes, not always, then conflict into how we move anatomically. So in this tutorial, I start to really explore the idea of objects or devices kind of placed under armpits or kind of placed across the rib cage, for example, that, again, to give real definition, can be, for example, then advantageous and helpful, say, for example, in creating awareness, providing feedback, giving someone a perception, very much the idea of skill acquisition, so when there's objects under the arms, or, for example, kind of objects kind of placed on the rib cage, to try and kind of almost encourage what some people perceive as, say, connection, which we'll look at shortly. That can be very, very helpful. But what we then need to explore and understand is the idea of kind of trades and solutions. There's never ever a solution, it's simply a trade. So, for example, what can be helpful sometimes for some, for example, how we move, say, for example, in the perception, the awareness, how some people define connection, can then often then come at a great almost trade to then what happens anatomically. So examples being that when we place, say, objects under the armpits, almost kind of devices across the kind of rib cage to improve what people perceive as connection, anatomically what invariably happens often then, for even, for example, say things then between the forearms, for example, to kind of then, almost attempt to hit shots with. Anatomically, what can then happen is we get very overactive, very compressed in the exact areas we're trying to decompress and almost reduce activity. So examples being, we know that when, say, pec minor, subscapularis, kind of bicep gets very overactive, they are tremendous constraints on rotation. So how well that kind of rib cage and spine rotate, for example, in swing, can get really challenging, very compressed, very overactive, very sticky in many areas when we start putting, say, for example, gloves under the armpits or objects between the forearms or objects kind of around that rib cage. We get very compressed, very narrow, very overactive through those areas, pec minor, pec major, even biceps subscapularis, even up into the kind of neck. We get very compressed in those areas. So again, the idea of kind of trades and solutions, what for some can often provide kind of helpful awareness of how they see connection, for example, through kind of arms and hands and rib cage and swing, anatomically is the complete opposite to then what actually is connection, as we'll come on to shortly. So again, anytime there's objects under the arms, into forearms, across that rib cage, can get us very compressed, how the rib cage gets kind of squeezed downwards. We get very active in areas such as kind of pec minor, for example, which we know then certainly makes kind of then the idea of rotation very challenging. So that then really kind of threads into the idea of kind of connection versus compression. Often we start using these devices, armpits, forearms, rib cage, for example. Actually what they encourage is not connection through the arms and the rib cage, it's more compression. We get very compressed, very squeezed, very jammed again, which is the absolute opposite to what we're trying to encourage in the idea of decompression. Width through the rib cage, length through the neck, so the idea of that kind of long neck, kind of wide rib cage, kind of wide arms in some ways. That truly is, when we look at, say, anatomically, how we define connection. Connection is really how well the shoulder blades rest and move and interact with that thorax, that rib cage, as it moves and swings. So for example, this could be if I let my scapula sit downwards and on the back of that thorax in a very kind of almost connected kind of restful way. This is a very connected kind of arm and rib cage movement, despite the arms almost perceiving to be disconnected off the rib cage. However, if I let my kind of scapula kind of elevate and protract forwards and get the arms very compressed in that, across that rib cage, this can appear like visually a very connected hand and arm, but it's simply a compressed arm onto rib cage. There's a tremendous difference in connection being how well those scapula rest and then interact and move on that thorax, that rib cage, as it moves in swing, rather than how compressed do we get, how narrow do we get to that rib cage, how forward do we get to that head and neck, how down and compressed do we then get through, say, for example, that diaphragm. So there's a tremendous difference in anatomically what is connection, how well the scapula rests on the thorax, and how well that scapula move with that thorax in swing, to then often how we see and perceive connection. So invariably, connection for some is actually compression. So what they're trying to achieve in some ways is the absolute opposite to actually what we're trying to produce within the goal swing. So in many ways, what players are often trying to achieve are actually what creates the issue when using, not always, and this is very much an individual responsiveness, and some very, very good cases and sometimes where these movements can be actually advantageous to some. It's just being much more defined in exactly what is it they're trying to do. There's a tremendous difference in compressing, which is often when objects are under the armpits, across the rib cage, between the forearms. That's what they invariably create, compression, which is the complete opposite to connection. Connection is that lovely long neck, wide rib cage, scapula sit down on the back of the rib cage. The idea of kind of hands and arms being much more connected through the scapula rather than compressed through. Often what happens anatomically when we kind of put objects under the arms, rib cage, balls, for example. So it's having that lovely concept of kind of trades and solutions. What, for example, can sometimes provide a solution as far as the awareness, the perception, almost the intent of how someone perceive connections with their hands and arms. The trade in reality is how it then really comes at a very compressed, overactive, kind of almost kind of jammed up and sticky kind of almost anatomical movement, which is the absolute opposite to what we're trying to then create in the idea of that lovely connected, rotated movement.